tough, but
Well, anyway, we'll see. Maybe he will. Maybe GK will out, and the current regime will forget about all that. When Steve asked me if I wanted to talk, I said sure. What do you want me to talk about? And he said, well, anything you want, from making fudge to whatever.
Sorry to interrupt, Doctor.
Oh, here he comes. He's a CIA mole, as we all know. He's been reporting on us for the last couple of years. You did know that, didn't you? Those religious fundamentalists. Okay. Anyway, so he walked in late. I thought what I would do is talk about one of his books. Maybe some of you have read it. Just tell me if you have. It's not one of his most well-known ones, I wouldn't say. It's called Irish Impressions. Is it one? Have you read that?
Yeah.
Ah, good. A couple of guys have read Irish Impressions. And it's interesting. So I thought I would talk about that and quote freely from it, because better to hear him than me. The book itself demands some explanation about how it was written and why. And what G.K. had done was he had gone to Ireland in late 1918. And this is him speaking. He went at the request of Irish friends who were working warmly for the Allied cause. Okay? And who conceived that I might at least be useful as an Englishman who had always sympathized as warmly with the Irish cause. I am under no illusions that I should ever be efficient at such work in any case, and under the circumstances I had no great hopes of doing much, and it was too late. I need not explain the motives that made me do the little I could do. They were the same that at that moment made millions of better men do masses of better work. Okay. Now, when he wrote this book, he would have presumed that everyone knew what he was talking about. His readers would have understood this Allied cause, and they also would have understood what this Irish cause was, with which he so warmly sympathized. But nowadays, that may bear a little explanation, so I thought I'd do that, talk a little bit about that. But instead of just starting at the Great War 100 years ago, in G.K.'s time, I thought if I could bore you a little bit, I thought I'd go back to where this all started, actually. And being a historian, you have to bore people for a while before you get to the meat and potatoes. So we really have to go back to the 12th century.
We have to.
We have to. But we're going to, okay?
Work up to 1960.
Yeah, work up to 1960. So
Get comfortable.
So get comfortable. Okay.
I hope you're going to say that the English are the scourge of the earth.
Well, I'll get to that. The Pope at this time. The Pope at this time.
In the 12th century?
His name is Hadrian the Fourth. Hadrian the Fourth. Sometimes you'll see in a book Hadrian's same guy. Okay. Hadrian the Fourth has a distinction as Pope. Does anyone know what it might be? He is the sole distinction. He is the sole English Pope. We've only had one English Pope. Presumably we're not going to have any more. And he's it. Actually, his real name was Nicholas Breakspear. What a cool name. Gotta give it to him.
You turned down the papacy for a name like that.
Yeah. He was a little unusual too, because his father was a monk. After the mother died, the father had become a monk, and he was not from, obviously not from an Italian family, which is usually what was going on. But in any case, Hadrian the Fourth comes to the papal throne. And in 1171, he does something. He issues a papal bull. It's called Laudabilitia. Laudabilitia. Okay? And Laudabilitia authorized the English king to do something, to invade Ireland. Thanks, Pope, right? It's not the first nor the last time these popes are going to cause problems for the Irish. The king at that time, as you may know, is also a rather high-profile English king. Is Henry II, and does anyone know him? What he's famous for? Exactly. Henry II is the king who has that problem with his ex-BFF, right? Thomas Becket, right? Who was he got him the job as Archbishop of Canterbury, and then, he did something that you just wouldn't expect. He started being holy and fucking the government, right? So anyway, we're not here to talk about Becket and Henry, although Henry's remembered mostly for that, but we're concerned about his invasion of Ireland. It was played by Peter O'Toole, I believe,
right.
in that movie.
Yeah. Yep.
And was it Richard Burton?
Richard
played
Burton.
Becket?
Was Becket.
We're talking about this cat, but I don't know. I guess not. Anyway, the Henry II had been authorized by the Pope to go invade Ireland. This was ostensibly to fix the church, the Irish church. That was supposed to be a mess, and as you may know, the church in Ireland developed differently than it did in most of the rest of Europe. It developed along eastern lines, more like what they had in the Near East. Okay, so that was the mess that the Pope wanted him to fix. But needless to say, he didn't spend too much time fixing the church. He spent a lot of time massacring people and blinding them and that sort of thing. Okay, well, this is important not because it represents the sort of first wave of these attacks, but it's important because it kind of sets a pattern here, both for sort of papal contempt, shall we say, or bad decisions regarding Ireland, and it also sets the pattern for English monarchs, right, and future activities against Ireland. Okay. All right, let's fast forward. We didn't have to stay in the 12th century here. We'll get up to the 16th century, 1542. And you know what has happened by that time in England. Our friend Henry VIII, right, has broken from the church. And he too decides to invade Ireland using Laudabilité as a precedent. And now, of course, things have changed a bit, because in the old days, when Henry II was alive, the English were all Catholic, and now added to that sort of racial contempt that the English traditionally had. Now what has been added to the pot is this is obviously the religious difference as well. Okay, he proclaims himself King of Ireland. Yes, not everyone in Ireland is happy about this. Ireland itself is still, which has always been that problem, is essentially tribal, with individuals calling themselves kings of this and kings of that, but none of them were able to really exert themselves, and so obviously whenever some foreign invader, usually the English, they were subject to conquest like this. Henry's daughter Elizabeth extends the English interest in Ireland. And there's an irony here, though, because some of the people who are most intransigent fighting the English are actually old English, right? Meaning the Normans who had come with Henry II. Those people were now Irish. This is 400 years later, and they considered themselves Irish, right? Even though they were from those old Norman families, which were from England and then originally from Normandy, right? So there's an irony there, I think, right? Names like Fitzgerald, Fitzwilliam, things like that, those are Norman names, right? All right, anyway, and they remain staunchly Catholic. Okay, let's fast forward to the next century. 1649, another English invasion, and this time this is from this Calvinist lunatic Oliver Cromwell. Right? Cromwell lands in Ireland, and his stated purpose is to exterminate the papist lice. What part of exterminate papist lice don't you understand, right? It's pretty clear what's going on there. And Cromwell is only in Ireland for a few months personally, but of course this is what happens here is still remembered and with great disdain, right? Cromwell essentially depopulates parts of Ireland, particularly in the north, in Ulster, and commits all sorts of atrocities, exterminations, massacres of women and children, etc., etc., the usual stuff. What he also does, Cromwell now really sets a pattern. Cromwell is a bit of a model for the 20th century totalitarian dictators that we're so familiar with, right? With killing these people off as efficiently as possible. And as we well know, the term is used nowadays, a great way to exterminate a lot of people quickly, instead of using swords or guns or what have you, is to weaponize food, right? The term that's used now. That is, it's easier to take food away, starve people to death. They can't fight you. This sort of thing. It's easier than spending money on gunpowder or whatnot. Okay. Anyway, so foodstuffs are destroyed, which causes famine, which causes plague. All right. So this is Cromwell's legacy in Ireland, and as I said, he's remembered to this very day for this purpose. There's something else that's interesting here too, and this intersects with American history. What Cromwell does is and actually the term is used at this time, plantation, right? Whenever you hear the word plantation, an American thinks naturally of what? In the South, in the American South, exactly right. But the plantation system actually began in Ireland, right? The idea was they were planting people here in Ireland, moving them from here to there, and moving people essentially from Scotland, right? These Calvinists, these Presbyterians were being moved into these areas that had been depopulated of Irish Catholics. The ones who weren't dead were rounded up and were sent to where? Where?
Australia?
Well, Australia a little bit later actually with that, but they were sent right to America. They were sent to America and also to the British colonies in the Caribbean. Now, when you were in junior high or whenever you had this, if you read this at all, they had a term for this in American textbooks. What term did they use? Anyone remember?
Indentured servants.
Indentured servants. But the more accurate term is slaves. They were slaves, there's no question about it. They weren't getting out of that. And there was no intention of letting them go or anything else. The idea was to work them to death. Right? That's what this is about. That muddies the waters, though, doesn't it? Because it kind of messes up the slavery narrative that we're supposed to believe that it's all based upon skin color. Of course not. Right? Never has been. It's an economic system. It's a labor system. Okay. Anyway, that's that. What comes in the wake of Cromwell's the total conquest of Ireland is, as probably most of you have heard of, these penal laws. And these penal laws are essentially an apartheid system. And now we go into a Dutch word, right? But everyone's familiar with that. Apartheid means apartness. And so you had three levels of people in Ireland, or three classes, shall we say. The top are called the ascendancy. And the ascendancy are English landlords and their Anglo-Irish counterparts in Ireland. They own all the land that has been stolen. Under them, and treated somewhat with contempt, are those people who have been planted. These are the Scots-Irish. It's what they're usually referred to in America. And we have many American presidents. Andrew Jackson, his family was Scots-Irish, and many others. But in any case, they were those sort of psychotic Presbyterians who hated the Catholics probably more than anything. And then, of course, you have the third class, the vast majority of population, still probably 95% of the population were Irish Catholics. And this, again, is a modern term, but they had no human rights at all. No legal rights, no human rights. The church was completely outlawed. Education was banned, it was outlawed. And so this is the situation that prevailed in Ireland throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. All right? Okay. Not very edifying. At the end of the 18th century, 1798, there's a major rebellion which is put down with great bloodshed. In the middle of the 19th century, in 1848, there's another rebellion. The British do something clever, though. They do something clever in the 19th century. They allow the Catholic hierarchy to be reestablished. In other words, they allow bishops back in. Gee whiz, that sounds like they're getting nice. It isn't quite so simple as that. The bishops that they allow here are their appointments. They appoint the bishops. Okay. Now you can go back to Henry II. You could go back to Barbarossa. You can go back further in history, but most of the conflicts that popes had with monarchs throughout history was over the appointment of bishops. Right? That was one of the main issues. Right? They didn't want the monarch appointing bishops. Right? Lay investiture. Why not? What happens if the monarch appoints the bishops? Or the government? Let's put it this way: the government. The bishops are just government stooges. They're government stooges. Okay? That's exactly right. So this is what happens in Ireland. The hierarchy is reestablished, but these bishops are essentially stooges of the English Protestant government. There's a contemptuous term for them that the Catholics will call them. They call them castle bishops. The castle means the man. Right? Okay. So that's the situation as of the 19th century. Well, by the end of the 19th century, enough progress has been made, quote unquote. Some of these penal laws have been dropped. But by the end of the 19th century, there's this proposition for home rule. And what home rule really means is this sort of idea that Ireland would be put into kind of a commonwealth status, right? Same thing we would see with Canada and some of their other colonies later. There are two home rule bills, one in 1886, one in 1893, and they fail. Okay? They fail. All right. There's a third attempt in 1912, so this shows you how long this is dragging on. There's a third attempt in 1912, and this home rule bill, the third home rule bill, passes. Well, joy, right? Everything's great now. No, because even though the bill has passed, the British say, but we're not going to implement it. So we passed it, but we have no intention of implementing it. And this radicalizes more people. Now, and Chesterton talks about this as well. The Irish are supposed to have this reputation for being hotheads and flying off the handle. As far as I'm concerned, they're far too docile, right? Then as now. But this is really the last straw. After this third home rule bill, and it was passed, and then they said, "Yeah, but we're just kidding. We're not gonna implement it anyway." All right. That's where things stood. So we've gone back to the 12th century, and in a nutshell, the relationship between England and Ireland has been unpleasant, to say the least. In 1914, the Great War breaks out. Of course, this is the term that's used at the time. The Great War breaks out, and the first thing the British do, well, it's not the first thing they do, but certainly what's on their minds here is to recruit in Ireland for the good old British forces. Right? Now, there's some irony here too, though, because after I've said all of these things, the British Army always had plenty of Irishmen in it. Right? There's a reason for that. You have to know a little bit about the history of armies. Most guys, until the 19th or the 20th century, these sort of bring the boys home and the yellow ribbons and that sort of. This is all very modern, right? Armies were not like that before, and patriotism was not used as a selling point, right? That's all very modern. The point is, most guys would go into the army. Why? Throughout history, for a job, essentially to even if they weren't paid, you had the chance to loot, right? Get booty and forage, right? And so that's what that was about. And many an Irishman had served in the ranks, the British ranks. So the fact that they're looking for more of them to fight isn't surprising at all. But the circumstances here were not all that auspicious. Okay, the British then do something that is even more duplicitous. They decide that, maybe we will allow home rule if you let us conscript. So now they're saying that, all right, well, we may introduce home rule if you go along with us conscript drafting, right? And this is the last straw for many people, right? In Easter of 1916, there's a rebellion. It's a small rebellion as usual. It has no chance of winning, of defeating the British. We refer to this as, traditionally it's referred to as what? This is the Irish do everything different than everyone else. And what is this, anyone know what this is usually referred to? Is this
Easter Rebellion?
Well, the Easter Rebellion, but it's considered a blood a blood sacrifice. In other words, we know we have no chance of winning, but if they kill us, maybe that will spur, others to rise. It's a particular way of looking at it. It's courageous, foolhardy horses' asses or something. I don't know. But the the Easter Rebellion, of course, is put down with great vehemence and violence. Artillery is brought into Dublin. There's atrocities committed by English soldiers and also by these Orange men, these sort of auxiliaries as they're called. We would now call them terrorists, but they're these Protestants who are helping the British Army. So that's thrown into the pot as well, what goes on here. The leaders of the rebellion who are captured are executed quickly. One guy had both legs broken, and he was put on a chair to hang him. So these things got a lot of publicity and caused some problems in America as well. Not that Irish Americans have much spank in politics, but it did cause a great deal of there was a great deal of attention paid to this in the middle of this war. So what happens here is this, and this is where it stands by 1917. Okay. So the British are fighting this war, and at the same time this Irish question is just never going away. It just can't. All right. Finally, I told you I'd bore you for a few minutes, so now let's get to our friend Chesterton. This is where he comes in. Chesterton is an extraordinary Englishman in a lot of ways, and the way that, or what we're talking about here tonight, is his view on Ireland. Even intellectual Englishmen, it's very rare to find a guy with his views. Right? His views are that this history that I've talked about is a disgrace. He is proud of being English, but he thinks this is a blot on English history, everything that's been done from this time. Okay, he's known as a quote-unquote friend of Ireland through his writings. Okay, so this is where he's brought into this, and these individuals ask him to go to Ireland at this time in 1918. Right? They don't know the war's going to end later on that year. But he's asked to go to Ireland and do recruiting again. Okay? Well, okay. He says okay. All right? You may say his sympathy towards the Irish would be because of shared faith. He's Catholic, but actually he's not, right? He doesn't convert until when? 1922, I believe, right? No, on that. It's after the war. And the funny thing is, if you know something about this story, English Catholics usually don't have too much sympathy for their Irish cousins anyway. I guess it's better being an Englishman than it is being Catholic, anyway, to them. But that's generally the feeling. Okay. So G.K. comes into this, and he considered it a misconceived effort. I suppose you can't succeed at anything if you know from the get-go, or feel from the get-go that it's a fraud in the first place. But he does this. There's an irony here too. I said I'd get to G.K., but let me throw in one more thing about the war. By 1918, the United States was involved in the war. Right? In 1917, the crazy Calvinist president we had at that time, Woodrow Wilson, had thrown America into the war. Right? Now, once again, this isn't the way it's taught in your usual classes, but in fact, this was a disaster. Because by 1916, both sides were sapped. The Allied powers, Britain and France, Russia was in collapse, and then the Central powers, Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, the other side, they too were bled dry. So by 1917, it's generally conceded both sides were near collapse. There were giant mutinies in the British and French armies, okay? And so probably in history we're not supposed to do woulda, coulda, shoulda, right? We're not supposed to do this was going to happen. But the fact is the war probably would have ended in 1917 with some sort of negotiated peace. Of all people, the German government, the imperial German government, started making noises to the Pope at that time, Benedict XV. Can you act as an intermediary? How do you like that? Right? The Pope had earlier, at the beginning of the war, he had offered to mediate, and both sides told him, drop dead. Right?
The Italians in the room.
I'm from Malden, anyway, the point here is this. We Americans aren't taught it this way, but it's a disaster that America gets involved because that's going to extend the war for another year. So everyone killed in that last year essentially is, you can hang on old Woody's neck, really, right? All right, anyway, my point about that is by 1918, the British didn't even have to do this. They really didn't have to do this because the Yanks were in the trenches then dying for the bloody butcher's apron rather than the Irish. But nevertheless, they go forward with this. Chesterton goes to Ireland. He enjoys his trip, okay? He goes on tour speaking, right? He thought asking Irishmen to die for England was ridiculous, but he went anyway, and he had an angle which I'll get to in a moment. And as I said, all of this is stemming from his book, which he writes after the war. It's published in 1919, and really it's his impressions, and that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about here tonight. Vignettes, almost like blogging, right? It's kind of things he did and just little stories, and a lot of his books are like that, actually, right? And it's probably one of the reasons he's so popular, right? It's not, you read these things and isn't that clever, his ideas about this and that. Okay, anyway, one of the things he likes about Ireland is, and here too this will ring a bell to everyone, is his sort of feeling that of the medievalism that is still extant, right? And the idea that even though union with England has not been a good thing, the Irish have been able to hold on to this sort of, and again that would be a term he would use, this medieval outlook on life and how they live their lives. Okay, this incident occurred at the end of his trip. He had spent time in the cities in Dublin and then in Belfast, so he had done the touring in the cities. But this incident I'm going to mention here happens at the end of the trip. This is him speaking again. All down one side of the road. He's driving down a country, he's in a country road. All down one side of the road, the harvest was gathered in neatly and safely, right? And all down the other side of the road, it was rotting in the rain. The side where it was safe was worked by peasant proprietors. The side with the rotting harvest was the land of a large estate, a large modern estate. G.K. asked his driver, "What's going on here?" It's like, "What's happening?" And the driver says, "Oh, you big R, they're having all sorts of strikes and labor problems and that sort of thing, right?" And so G.K. observes that, well, the capitalist, the money grubber, and the Bolshevist striker had gotten together. You see, they had cooperated to produce a stoppage, right? They're working together, really. England may seem to be rent by an irreconcilable rivalry between capital and labor, but the peasant across the road is both a capitalist and a laborer. It must be sharply realized that the peasant proprietors succeeded here, Not only because they were really proprietors, but because they were only peasants. Huh? It was because they were on a small scale that they were a great success. It was because they were too poor to have servants that they grew rich in spite of strikers. On the left side of the road, the big machine had stopped working because it was a big machine. The small men were still working because they were not machines. As a point of personal opinion, I believe that the right side of the road was really the right side of the road. Okay. So this medievalism that he's talking about that still existed in Ireland was achieved, or was they still existed there in spite of the Unionism, and in spite of these people being jammed between the Scylla of capital and the Charybdis of labor, right? And he addresses this home rule bill here again, and how they had been rebuffed for the third time, or they had been rebuffed twice, and the third time the British had double-crossed them. Okay? G.K. had observed that there's only so many times that people can be betrayed. Once again, this is him speaking. In the political bargain with the English, the Irish simply think that they have been cheated. They think home rule was stolen from them after the contract was sealed, and it will be hard for anyone to contradict them. The Irish have now returned in reaction of anger to their most extreme demands, not because we denied what they demanded, but because we denied what we accepted. Right? Whatever we decide to give to Ireland, we must give it. It is now worse than useless to promise it. I will say here, once and for all, the hottest thing that an Englishman has to say of his impression of another great European people, that over all those hills and valleys our word is wind and our bond is waste paper. Okay. Well, he's facing up to this fact that the Irish had no cause to want to fight for the English in their struggle with Germany. I had hoped primarily to help England, but not being a congenital idiot, did not primarily ask an Irishman to help the English. And his idea was to ask the Irish to help themselves, essentially by helping save Western civilization. Western civilization against Prussianism. Once again, this is sort of a word that has kind of gone by the boards. Prussianism. But as you know, probably many of you have read, he uses this a lot, this term, as well as his buddy Belloc wrote a great deal about Prussianism. All right, get back to that, exactly what they mean. Here, the Allies were more right than they realized. Nay, they hardly had a right to be so right as they were. The modern Babylon of capitalistic states was hardly worthy to go on such a crusade against the heathen, as perhaps decadent Byzantium was hardly worthy to defend the cross against the crescent. But we are glad that it did defend the cross against the crescent. And here, he blames the rebels not for rebelling against the government, but for not joining, for being opposed to the war. I entirely sympathize with their being in revolt against the British government. I'm in revolt against the British government myself. But politics are a fugitive thing in the face of history. Does anybody want to be fixed forever on the wrong side of the Battle of Marathon through a quarrel with some archon whose very name is forgotten? Okay. Well, we can certainly see what he's getting at, right? As we said, both he and Belloc wrote a great deal about this Prussianism. What he meant by that was Protestantism, the Protestantism of the German and English states, money worship and authoritarian rule divorced entirely from Christian considerations. So this is what they're talking about with Prussianism, and of course the living embodiment of this is Kaiser Wilhelm. Back to him in a moment. So we can't say he was wrong for thinking this way. He's consistently right about first things. But still, as we were talking about earlier, Chesterton is a man of his age, we all are, and he doesn't have the power of divination. There's this great fear of these guys of Prussianism, personified by William of Hohenzollern. You know William, right? The Kaiser, he's got the mustache that's pointing up, and the Pickelhaube, and the ludicrous uniforms. One of his arms was withered too. He had a short arm. and he had Mauser, and he had the gun companies making special guns for him that he only had to use a pistol, sort of rifle type thing, but he used his arm. Anyway, you know who we're talking about. And the Kaiser was a wonderful caricature that could be made sport of. But anyway, Imperial Germany was defeated, and the Nazi successor is going to be defeated as well. And we have to ask ourselves where we are now. What have these victories of these good guys wrought? We don't really see much left of Western culture in the modern democracies. Our modern rulers, go through the list here, despise everything that Chesterton held dear. Anyway, that's getting ahead of the story. He couldn't see what was going to happen, even though these victories that he was, or the victory that he was so adamant about, hasn't turned out all that well. Talking about politics being a fugitive thing in history. Okay. Now, as always, G.K. could turn a situation inside out and see it more clearly than many people looking at it straight on. And one thing that he did note here that most English people were not willing to admit at this time was that England and Germany had always been what? Buddies. Yeah, they had been allied for a long time. All right, and they had essentially worked in collusion against France and Ireland, Catholic France and Ireland. All right. England and Germany, as we know, were the first two major powers, Scandinavia as well, but England and Germany were the first two major powers that had been converted to Protestantism, and they had that bond. All right? Now, once more, we have to go back into the story to see how it's what's germane to what's happening in the Great War. In 1701, in England, Parliament passes the Act of Settlement. Does anyone know what that was about? The Act of Settlement. What that was about was this, and I've been teaching these young kids for years, teaching this material, and this story always gets me, no matter what. The Act of Settlement is passed, and what that says essentially is that no Roman Catholic will ever sit on the throne of England again. And by the way, that's still effective today. Okay. All right. What happened was this. James II, a Stuart Catholic, not a very good Catholic, of course. Catholics didn't have much to pick from here with the Stuarts. But anyway, James II was ousted by his son-in-law, William of Orange, and his daughter, right? James's Protestant daughter, Mary. That's called the Glorious Revolution. He was ousted, all right? And these two took the throne. After Mary died, William ruled on his own, and then Mary's sister took over. She's Queen Anne. Okay? Neither William or Mary nor Queen Anne had issue. They had no children. Right? I think she was pregnant 17 times, but never had a child. So this is what you've got here now. I think she died in 1714, but this law had been passed even earlier because they were anticipating that she would have no children. The English are now stuck again because the nearest relatives are Stuarts. There are still Stuarts alive. Bonnie Prince Charlie, his dad was still alive, who would have been James III, a guy they called the Old Pretender. Right? He lived until for a long time. He lived until the latter part of the 18th century. So the point is this: when Anne died, the next in line by any Indus would have been one of the other Stuarts. Okay? The problem is they were still Catholic. So the Act of Settlement had been passed, and the British decided there would never be another Catholic on the throne. Right? Now, this is what I was talking about a moment ago about when I teach this to children, my students. It's just, to me, this is incomprehensible, but this is what they do. Anyone know what they do?
German.
They grab a German. Does that make any sense to you? They go to a cousin here, and he is George of Hanover. And they haul him over, and he becomes George the First of England. Okay? He's a German. He can't speak English, and he has no intention to. He doesn't like the English, but it's a bigger prize than Hanover. It's a better gig, you know. Carnegie Hall rather than the Lee side. Exactly. Oh no. All right. So better gig for George and George II, who also doesn't learn English. But this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about Prussianism. This whole thing is, I think, to me, it makes me laugh every time I think of it. That hatred of the church is so deep that they bring this foreigner over. Okay, and once again, we were talking about American history a few minutes ago. This comes into our story as well, right, into our picture with George III, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. George III actually grew up in England and considered himself English. But the English didn't like him much either, right, as we well know. And what I was saying here was this German element. You might have asked yourself this question when you read this in school. Who was fighting with the British, with the Redcoats here in America during the American Revolution? Germans. Hessians. The Hessians was like a term for German mercenaries who fought with the British, and that's why, because of that connection. Okay, I remember that when I was a kid. Say, what do they got to do with the price of eggs here? But the was Yosemite Sam, I think, was one time he was a Hessian.
They started all the Hess gas stations.
The Hess gas station, yeah, exactly, right. Okay. Anyway, the Great War, World War I, finally makes a mockery, and they had been friendly up until that time. In the latter part of the 19th century, the British were getting scared because the crazy Kaiser wanted a blue water navy, so he was building battleships. The British called them dreadnoughts, but he wanted a battleship navy, so they were getting worried that their cousin here was crazy. And come to think of it, too, I mean, he was an actual cousin, right? Queen Victoria was his grandmother, and so Kaiser Willie here, was a cousin of the English king, and who was the other cousin? The Russian Tsar was also one of her grandsons. So it shows you how sort of incestuous that whole story was. That mess. They used to write to each other, dear Willie and dear Nicky, Nicholas. Okay, anyway, as I said, the Great War makes a mockery of that Anglo-German alliance. For the supreme joke was this, says G.K., that the Englishman has not only boasted of being an Englishman, he has actually boasted of being a German. As the modern mind began to doubt the superiority of Calvinism to Catholicism, all English books, papers, and speeches were filled more and more with a Teutonism, which substituted a racial for a religious superiority. Unionism was simply founded on Teutonism. Okay. Now, as far as this attempt to recruit in Ireland at the same time the English government was threatening to conscript in Ireland, of course, Chesterton believed this madness. But even this plea for volunteers was done so badly that it could not possibly be successful. And whether the English would just be fogged by anti-Catholicism or just be fogged, they couldn't see what was going on here. Okay, listen to this. The mere sight of some representative Belgian priests and nuns might have produced something like a crusade. The matter seems to have been left mostly to elderly English landlords. It would be cruel to record their adventures. I heard on excellent testimony that these unhappy gentlemen had displayed throughout Ireland a poster that had nothing on it, consisted only of the Union Jack and the appeal, "Is this not your flag? Come fight for it." And G.K. says, it faintly recalls something we all learned in Latin grammar about questions that expect the answer, no. This would be not unlike the Turks had placarded Armenia with the crescent of Islam and asked all the Christians who were not yet massacred whether they did not love the flag. I really do not believe the Turks would be so stupid as to do so. Good side. Okay. And he pondered the asininity of the Colonel Blimps. I don't know if asininity is a real word, but I thought it would be good anyway. Of these Colonel Blimps. G.K. considers that the whole thing might have been a fraud anyway. It is said, with a dreadful plausibility, that the Unionists were deliberately trying to prevent a large Irish recruitment, which would certainly have meant reconciliation and reform. In plain words, it is said that they were willing to be traitors to England if they could only still be tyrants to Ireland. Only too many facts can be made to fit in with this, but for me it is still too hideous to be believed. And once again, we're living a century after all this. It doesn't sound too hideous to be believed, does it? Not at all. Everything that we've seen since then. I think his basic decency here and optimism kind of made him say that. That's too hideous to be believed. Who knows what the truth was there? But in any case, he didn't. His idea that a large Irish recruitment would have led to this, melting England's cold heart had really no basis in reality. As we said, Irish troops had fought in all of England's wars for many years, and that certainly hadn't affected the situation at all. And there were plenty of Irish men already rotting in the mud of France. Okay. Anyway, our friend Chesterton abandons this prospect of recruiting. He did as he went around, he made some speeches and probably enjoyed the pubs more than anything else. He knew this was not going to work. Right? He thought it was a bad work and a misfire from the get-go, and he thought that the English involved were actually parodying themselves. Right? But then he noted that the greatest self-parody that he had ever seen, or what the English parody paled in comparison to, was what he encountered in Belfast. And once again, as we recall, in Belfast we have these Orange men, and they were the ones who had been furiously against home rule. Right? They feared, the last thing they wanted was for an Irish Republic because they feared payback. Right? Payback never did come, right? But it would have been very much understandable, right? Predictable for everything, because of everything that had gone on here. And G.K. mentions here too, once again, that he says, the English have this idea that the Irish are these sort of people, dreamers, who live in this kind of fantasy land. He found them to be very earthy people, down to earth and honest. Right? So once again, this is his stock and trade. He's always in opposition to the crowd. But he says the people who he found to be living in the self-delusion of madmen were these people whom he met in Belfast, and he'd gone to Belfast after touring the rest of Ireland. And he told them a story that this story was told him about mothers there in the north. And again, these are the Presbyterians, right? And the mothers would say, for instance, if a child was near some sort of a stagnant pool or something, some body of water, they'd say, "Don't go near there. There's wee popes in there. They'll drag you down." Right? In other words, the boogeyman here was wee popes. There's wee popes that live in wee means small, and they're in the water to drag Protestant children. And he thought this was crazy. He said, if Belfast is not exactly a land of fairies, it is certainly a land of goblins. Right? People who squired him around were these merchants, these businessmen. And he found them very polite. They were nice to him. And showed him around. And he found, but he believed that every last one of them was completely unhinged. In other words, completely out of touch with reality. And he gave an example of this. They told him, they had just finished saying to him, "There is no poverty in Belfast." And he said, they didn't say poverty is getting better, or we're working on it, or things aren't as bad as they used to be. they assured him that there was no poverty in Belfast. And as if to sort of punctuate this, a ragamuffin came running up to him, a kid with hardly any clothes on, obviously absolutely destitute, begging him for money, begging him for a coin. And he's already, you could see this fat guy trying to find a coin in his pocket or something like that. And the merchants ran him off. Against the law! Against the law! They drove the kid away. And he's like this. And his response to this was, he was stunned. Even for him, I guess, he was stunned. They would not understand if I told them what legend might have been made of this child in the Christian ages of the world. So wholly are these people sundered from more Christian traditions that their very boasts lower them, and they abase themselves when they mean to exalt themselves. Okay. Anyway, he also observed that the Orangemen were great fans of, do we have to guess here, of William of Prussia, right? He was a big favorite there. They equated William of Prussia, Kaiser Willie here, with William of Orange, and they saw him as the new Protestant deliverer from the East. Okay. And again, this Prussian autocrat is the new Protestant deliverer. If ever there was a natural alliance in the world, it would have been the alliance between Belfast and Berlin. Right? So Chesterton leaves Ireland. His mission was a fiasco. The war soon ended anyway in the Allies' favor. And as we said before, what victory has meant for the West after all this time is nigh on inexplicable, if not unspeakable. He does publish his book as The Irish Impressions in a very sympathetic and understanding Englishman. He wasn't yet officially Catholic, as we mentioned, but he did perceive something that many Irish have forgotten today or have consciously rejected with a lot of good cause, and maybe to paraphrase his buddy Bullock, that the faith is Ireland and Ireland is the faith. Okay? And shortly before leaving the country, G.K. was enjoying a beautiful sunset from a mountain along the coast. And this was his last Irish impression. This is what I'll leave you with. I remembered that the men of this island had once gone forth, not with the torches of conquerors or destroyers, but as missionaries in the very midnight of the Dark Ages, like a multitude of moving candles that were the light of the world. Okay, and that's G.K. Chesterton's Irish Impressions.
Thank you.